Welcome back. Next up is Matt, a very well-known IoT analyst. He wrote several books, and he's going to share his view on the LP1 market with you today. Enjoy his talk.
Good afternoon. I'm Matt Hatton. I'm one of the founding partners at Transforma Insights. During this session, I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about IoT forecasts, something which I am eminently qualified to talk about, having been forecasting this thing that we called IoT and machine to machine before that for the best part of a decade, in fact over a decade. I'm not going to be using any slides, which may be a bit of a surprise to some who have sat through sessions about IoT forecasts before, but I think we're probably all heartily sick of PowerPoint and have been for most of the last year. Yesterday I delivered a workshop which went into the detail about how you might forecast the market opportunity for your organisation. Useful stuff for business planning, for going into pitch decks, all sorts of reasons why you might want to do that. This session though, I'm going to take a step back and look at how we're doing. Look at our market forecast, look at understanding what the market is doing, what the market for IoT is doing, and what the opportunity might be for you. First off, a few words about the ideas behind forecasting. As you could tell, anybody who joined the workshop yesterday, it's actually a relatively simple process. And I'll let you into a little secret. It's not that hard. We don't have magic powers. There are a few clever tricks and tips and some pitfalls that we know how to avoid, and bear traps, and we know where the bodies are buried in terms of the challenges associated with doing market forecasting, which makes it a little bit easier for us. But that's not really why we get paid the medium-sized bucks. The secret is that we have the freedom and the time to build these models and to research them as thoroughly as possible. There's a healthy element of garbage in, garbage out about IoT forecasts. So the more time and effort you put into hunting input data and finding that data and tracking down as much information about the market as you can, the better. Effectively, it's a shared cost, shared amongst all of our clients. To build as complex a model as we use costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. To set that up and maintain it, it's a substantial cost. Also, there's an element of we're exposed to certain market data and non-specific guidance that other people just might not have access to. So there is some element of that. But mostly it's a question of scale. If, for instance, you wanted to forecast a microscopic market like the opportunity for street lighting in the Noord-Holland region of the Netherlands, you could probably spend a day on it and get to a forecast for that specific area, which is way more accurate than any analyst would have. But if you want to know how many LoRa modules are going to be sold in 2025, you're better off talking to a specialist, because we do the hundreds and thousands of different analyses of all of the different individual markets to build up that full picture. And it's just not cost effective to do it yourself if you want to understand the whole market opportunity. Why am I talking about this? Because it's important. It's important to understand in the context of the market growth that we've seen and the expectations of market growth that we've seen in comparison to predictions. And also, you need to understand what the market's going to look like, what the market opportunity is going to be, so that you can plan this, so you can strategize, you can work out where your organization is going to go. Change direction slightly. Last year, during 2020, I published a book called The Internet of Things Myth. The starting point for that book was IoT forecasts, and specifically IoT forecasts done in around 2010, 2011 by some organizations that really grabbed the headlines. They were things like, well, specifically 50 billion connected devices by 2020. That was the number that really grabbed the headlines. Now, the end of 2020 was just a couple of weeks ago. And actually the figure, according to us at Transforma Insights, is more like a little over 9 billion connected devices worldwide. Might have been closer to 10 if it hadn't been for COVID. So why were the predictions so high? Why were we looking at predictions of 50 billion? And are we doing badly? I think a good starting point is to talk to me. I've been doing this for a decade. I should understand what the market looks like. So that's what I want to do. I want to share some views on why we didn't hit 50 billion devices. Well, first off, it has to be pointed out that not everyone was forecasting 50 billion connected devices. My old company, Makina Research, was forecasting 12 billion connected devices by 2020 when we did our first forecast in 2011. Now that's 25% out, so rather than going from 2 billion to 12 billion, we actually went from 2 billion to 9 billion, but I think that's not bad. What accounts for the 50 billion? Well, enthusiasm and aspiration is possibly a polite way of putting it. That certainly permeated a lot of people's forecasts. So why did we see that? Now, there's a lot of reasons why we might have expected to see a lot of enthusiasm for IoT. Certainly during the 2010s, and particularly the first half of the 2010s, the barriers to adoption were falling quite dramatically. What we saw was a big reduction in pricing for things like hardware, for the modules and chipsets that go into IoT devices. We saw a big fall in the cost of connectivity, for wide area connectivity, certainly. So you've got that price decline, opens up more opportunities. You also had a significant reduction in the complexity of developing and deploying IoT solutions. The platformization, if you like, where we saw connectivity platforms, application enablement platforms, making it much easier. Over the course of 5 years, you went from having to develop everything from scratch to having some really powerful tools to be able to help you build and deploy your IoT solution. That all happened in more or less the first half of that decade, 2010 to 2015. The second half, things slowed down a bit, and we got into what I have described in the past as being the first IoT winter. Anybody familiar with artificial intelligence will know that AI goes in for winters quite a lot. They're pretty popular. They've had 2 already, and we might or might not be on the cusp of a third one. So what are these winters? Well, they're slower periods, and periods specifically where the market has to catch up with having had some quite rapid technological development, as indeed we saw in the first half of the 2010s. But that doesn't account for all of it. Enterprises and consumers generally have struggled to adopt and deploy new IoT technologies. The question is, why? First one to look at and sort of get out the way, regulation. There's a whole load of IoT applications which are regulated, and therefore you would expect the regulations would drive adoption. Things like cash registers in the Czech Republic need to be connected, and fire alarms in the UAE likewise. Smart metering, e-call in Europe. These were all regulated applications that had specific timescales where we would expect them to be adopted. But many of them weren't adopted in quite as rapid a time period as we would have expected. Smart metering in the EU fell short by something like 200 million connections by 2020, or at the end of 2020, versus what the initial rollout requirements had stated. So anybody forecasting smart meter adoption back in 2010 or during the period would have expected significantly more smart meters in Europe. Similar sort of thing happened with eCall, where the requirement for this emergency service response in all vehicles was gradually pushed back. That might account for 100 million shortfall. And there's a number of other examples. You've got, for instance, government investment in India in smart cities. There was an expectation there was going to be significant money ploughed into smart cities, but it doesn't really seem to have translated into large volumes of connected devices. that's regulation, but actually the more pronounced shortfall has really been in discretionary IoT adoption. First problem you had, and the thing that fooled a lot of IoT forecasters, was the expectation that some of these really wacky ideas for connected products would actually turn into real markets. So you had connected dental floss and toasters and toothbrushes and so forth. The benefits to the users of connecting that thing weren't really material and didn't reflect the additional cost premium. Think about the smart fridge. Now, there is a benefit for the smart fridge. Mostly that's for the fridge manufacturer. But if it's for the fridge manufacturer rather than for the user, then that changes the economics. The manufacturer has to pay for it rather than the end user, which results in slower adoption. User experiences often were bad as well. You saw the bricking of garage doors and lighting systems and music systems. Effectively, developers were applying internet practices to physical products. We also saw security scares. I'm not going to talk about security in this session. There isn't any time to even scratch the surface, but concern about Mirai botnet and ring hacks and all sorts of other things of a similar ilk will have caused some concern amongst users that this was inherently insecure. There's also a fair amount of blame on the part of the ecosystem and the vendor ecosystem particularly. Flaws in addressing the IoT opportunity. We saw companies trying to play in parts of the value chain that they never should have been in. We've seen companies chasing unicorn valuations. We've seen companies struggling to externalize internal product capabilities, which might be leading edge for them internally, but actually they lack some of the commercial capabilities to take them externally. So across IoT, we've seen bad ideas, we've seen good ideas done badly, and we've seen an ecosystem that wasn't perfect. There is, however, good reason for believing that actually a lot of those issues have been resolved. Similarly, there's hope that on the part of the adopters we're seeing significant improvement in terms of their understanding of how they can adopt IoT. Historically, they were really only ready for the low-hanging fruit IoT applications like cost-cutting and efficiency-saving, supply chain as a good example. They weren't historically ready for the transformational business models and the commercial and organisational change that was required as a result. So where are we now? Well, we're not at 50 billion connected devices, that's for sure, and we won't be for quite a while. That's more an aspiration than it is a reasonable target. As I said, Transforma Insight says 25 billion connected devices by 2030. It's not a hockey stick. Never was a hockey stick. IoT isn't a single market that could be a hockey stick. It's a series of overlapping and semi-related markets that overall result in a growth which is steady, shall we say. But this is an exciting time to be in IoT. A lot of those wrinkles that I talked about have been ironed out. There's also some very interesting developments happening, for instance, with the arrival of the hyperscalers, AWS and Microsoft on the scene, clearly very interested. And as I mentioned earlier, adopters much more capable, I think, of adopting IoT, much more aware of the challenges internally that they need to overcome. After all, many of the adopters are talking digital transformation and the initiatives that they're doing there, much of which is really IoT in another name. As part of that, we're expecting significant growth for unlicensed low power wide area. Over 40% growth this year is our expectation after, let's face it, a pretty slow 2020. And of course, LoRa is a technology that is set to be strongly placed to dominate that as a category. Where is the opportunity? The opportunity is to overcome some of those challenges that we've seen over the last 10 years. Valuable products, developed to be user-friendly, and an ecosystem around it which really delivers. Thank you for your attention.